grim morning, and welcome to the Grim. I'm your host, Kristin. On today's episode, we'll be opening the gate and entering Old Gray Cemetery, located in Knoxville, Tennessee. The aroma of coffee mingles in the air. The gates stand open. Step carefully. It's time to descend into the hauntings of history. I realized the other day that we've actually never wandered into a Tennessee graveyard on the Grim, and honestly, it's about time. I've covered so many places, I'm not sure how Old Gray slipped past me, but today we're fixing that. Knoxville, sitting right at the gateway to the Great Smoky Mountains, feels like the perfect place to start. Appalachian lore is thick in this region. Ghost stories sink into the soil here, and Old Gray standing at the threshold does not disappoint. Old Gray Cemetery is Knoxville's second oldest resting ground. The time has draped it in much older sorrow. It feels ancient, an island of quiet grief where marble angels weather beneath Tennessee's skies. Founded in 1850, its 13 acres cradle the remains of statesmen and soldiers, painters and reformers, voices that once shaped the city and now linger only in stone and shadow. Victorian era sculptures rise like frozen mourners, their carved robes and folded wings softened by a century and a half of rain. In 1996, this solemn garden was added to the National Register of Historic Places, though the dead never needed a title to justify their significance. The grounds were named after the poet Thomas Gray, whose elegy written in a country churchyard seemed to whisper its way across the ocean. Holgray is a quintessential garden cemetery. These were burial grounds designed to be as much for the living as the dead. They were peaceful, spacious, unfurling at the edges of town, where churchyard crowding gave way to winding paths and quiet trees. Unlike its tight predecessor, First Presbyterian Cemetery, Old Gray was designed to have breathing room, broad plots, sweeping shade, and monuments that reach heavenward like marble prayers. Tennessee Williams found enough melancholy here to slip it into The Man in the Overstuffed Chair, and Peter Taylor echoed its presence in the Tennessee country. For decades, though, it was simply Gray Cemetery, until a newer counterpart opened a mile away in 1892, leaving this one with the elder name, the elder bones, and the elder shadows. It became the ancestral ghost of Knoxville's burying grounds, older in spirit than its years. But how did this garden cemetery in Tennessee take shape? In the 1840s, Pere Lachaise cast its long theatrical shadow across Europe and America, and Knoxville began yearning for a necropolis worthy of its own sorrows. Fear over the quiet architect of cemeteries took hold when whispers claimed that the First Presbyterian Church Cemetery had birthed the deadly epidemic of 1838. Whether rumor or truth, the fear was enough to turn the city outward. So in 1850, guided by William B. Reese, a board of trustees sought land where silence gathered naturally, a place where they could both be near the living and wholly claimed by the dead. The plot chosen was once open pasture land just beyond Knoxville's northwest limits, close enough for a brisk carriage ride, yet far enough to feel like a refuge from the city's bustle. It was peaceful ground, the kind of place where the wind seemed to move with intention. Landscape architect Frederick Douglass shaped that calm into soft curves and winding paths, and it was Reese's wife Henrietta who added the final touch of poetry by suggesting the cemetery bear the name Thomas Gray. But the dead didn't wait for dedications or speeches. The first burial came in July of 1851, when William Martin was killed by a cannon explosion during the city's Independence Day celebration. His grave went unmarked, though a small memorial stone now stands discreetly in the northwest corner, a quiet reminder that Old Gray's story began not with ceremony, but with catastrophe. In the summer of 1854, Knoxville found itself in the grip of a cholera epidemic. The kind of terror that moved faster than any news could travel and struck harder than any storm. Cholera didn't linger. It arrived suddenly without ceremony, hitching a ride in contaminated wells and shared cups, invisible until it wasn't. One moment a person felt fine, and then hours later they were slipping away, dehydrated beyond saving, their families powerless to stop it. Knoxville was no stranger to hardship, but cholera brought a new kind of panic to the city that had never been seen. Entire households were struck in a matter of days. Doctors still operating under the hazy medical understanding of the era worked frantically, but remedies were few and hope even fewer. The disease claimed people from all walks of life laborers, mothers, children, and even prominent citizens until the city's little churchyards could no longer keep pace with the dead. And so Old Gray, still in its infancy, became the city's refuge for the fallen. Wagon after wagon arrived at its gates, each bearing another sudden loss. Though there was no time for elaborate mourning, no space for prolonged ritual, burials needed to be swift, both for public health and the emotional survival of the living. The cemetery's earliest rows hold those victims still. Knoxvillians whose final days were marked by fear and fever, who found their rest here long before Old Gray grew into the stately sanctuary it would become. The epidemic carved its name into the cemetery's history, a first communal grief settling over the grounds like a low, lingering fog. But sorrow returned again, in different form this time, though more violent in scale. On September morning in 1904, when two Southern Railway passenger trains met head on near the small town of New Market, just east of Knoxville. Trains were symbols of progress then, iron arteries stitching the South together, carrying families, soldiers, businessmen, dreamers. But on that day, miscommunication and human error aligned with tragic precision. One train, number 15 local, was meant to pull aside into a siding. Messages were delayed, warnings were missed, and the Carolina Special, barreling forward with steam pressured high and passengers unaware, continued straight into disaster. Witnesses said you could hear the collision miles away. Two locomotives, each thundering forward at full speed, collided with such force that one engine was hurled into the air. Wooden passenger cars crumpled instantly beneath the weight of the steel. Survivors described clouds of splintered boards and the hiss of scalding steam, with cries rising from entanglement of metal and smoke. More than 50 people died instantly, and over 100 were injured. It was one of the worst rail disasters Tennessee had ever seen. Relief trains rushed the injured to Knoxville General Hospital nearby, and others were brought directly to Old Gray, some identified, some not, all carried gently through the cemetery gates by solemn hands. Families arrived stunned, their days suddenly split into before and after. Ministers spoke hurried prayers, and Old Gray, which had already weathered an epidemic sorrow, opened its arms once again to tragedy. Today, the victims of New Market lie in several clusters throughout the cemetery, their gravestones quiet testimonies to a disaster still remembered in local lore. Old Gray's layout carries the same strange poetry as its history. Its borders form an awkward pentagon, the main entrance opening toward Broadway like both an invitation and a warning. The paths follow the land's natural rise and fall rather than cutting against it, roads curling, graves tilting gently with Earth's contours, trees leaning close as if listening, iron gates, marble posts, and a low stone wall embrace the grounds, while the historic St. John's Lutheran Church keeps vigil across the street. Beyond the gate, the central road splits into a circle where the Albers Fountain once rose 20 feet into the air, its water long stilled. To the northwest, Old Gray shares a boundary with Knoxville's National Cemetery, a narrow, solemn divide between two realms of the departed. Unlike modern cemeteries that favor granite's hard permanence, Old Gray remains a kingdom of marble, soft, luminous, and tender to time. Its monuments weather like slipping memories, names blur, wings soften, faces grow faint as though the years are gently erasing their grief. Yet that same fragility allowed Victorian sculptures to carve emotion deeply into stone. Folded robes, bowed heads, sorrow etched into every downcast gaze. These angels stand everywhere, guardians of Knoxville's forgotten dead, their expressions mellowed by rain and moss. Obelisks punctuate the landscape like exclamation marks from another century, rising toward a sky that has changed far more than they have. In their day, they symbolized endurance and aspiration, slender needles of remembrance fashionably in the late 19th century. Among them stand stranger silhouettes, the woodmen of the world monuments. At first glance, they seem like rough, uncut tree trunks, bark textured, limbs severed, but they're actually marble, carved to resemble the stumps of felled lives. provided to the members of the fraternal order as a final benefit. Scattered across the grounds, they form a ghostly grove of stone. Crosses are plentiful too, with Celtic knots looping endlessly in circles of life, death, and return. Yet it's the human figures that linger in your memory. The Horn Monument features a near life size Confederate soldier carved in marble, standing eternal watch over William and John Horn. His face is solemn, his posture stiff, more a ghost than an actual guardian. Nearby, an elegant figure by an Italian sculptor Antonio Babelotti keeps vigil over the parents of art collector Eleanor Swan Ajodi, a whisper of Roman artistry resting quietly in Tennessee soil. And towering above many plots is the obelisk of Frank S. Meade, carved by Knoxville sculptor D. H. Jedds. Once used in advertisements for Meade's Marble Company, and now serves as both a memorial and the stone signature of a man who built his livelihood from the earth beneath his feet. Old Gray's monuments do more than mark graves. They shape the atmosphere itself, turning the cemetery into a landscape where art, memory, and mourning blend beneath the shifting Tennessee clouds. For generations, visitors have whispered about the uneasy company kept beneath this soil. Here lie enemies close enough to see one another across the grass, proximity bestowed only by death's indifferent hand. Among those most infamous are Joseph Alexander Mabry Jr. and his son, Joseph Mabry III, and banker Thomas O'Connell, men whose bitter feuds erupted into an 1882 gunfight. The Mabry O'Connell feud was one of Knoxville's bloodiest and most sensational public conflicts. So dramatic, in fact, that Mark Twain devoted an entire chapter to it in Life in the Mississippi. But before Bluets flew across Gay Street in the afternoon in 1882, the two families were already locked into a downward spiral of lawsuits, humiliation, and violence. It began with Joseph Alexander Mabry Jr., a wealthy landowner and a Confederate quartermaster whose post-war reputation was checkered by financial ruin and political maneuvering. His son Joseph Mabry III carried his father's temper like a badge. Opposing them was Thomas O'Connor, a respectable banker and businessman whose rising success came to grate against the Mabrys' declining influence. Their feud erupted when Mabry Jr. accused O'Connor of manipulating business dealings and damaging his reputation. O'Connor in turn believed the Mabrys were threatening him. Tensions escalated into lawsuits, duels challenged and withdrawn, and the ugly public arguments until finally it boiled over. On December 24th, 1882, the feud reached its violent climax. Father and son confronted O'Connor on Gay Street. Accounts differ, but what's agreed upon is that shots rang out almost immediately. O'Connor firing to defend himself and the Mabrys firing back. When the smoke cleared, all three men lay dead: Mabry Jr., Mabry III, and Thomas O'Connor. Crowds gathered. Newspapers devoured the story. Twain later described the shootout with a mixture of fascination and horror. Today, their graves form a triangle of uneasy quiet and old gray, close enough that no one could imagine, each man still watching the other, locked in a standoff that death never resolved. Tensions in Old Grey doesn't belong solely to gunfighters. It also lingers in the spaces carved by politics and war. On one side lies William Parson Brownlow, the firebrand Methodist preacher, editor of the Knoxville Whig, and one of Tennessee's most polarized figures. He attacked secessionists, slaveholders, and anyone who threatened the Union with words so blistering that Confederate authorities arrested him and banished him during the Civil War. In April 1865, just days before the Confederacy officially surrendered, Brownlow became governor of Tennessee, stepping into power at a moment when the state was fractured and raw. As governor, he reintegrated Tennessee into the Union with a mixture of moral fever and political ruthlessness. He disenfranchised former Confederates, marshaled state laws against Ku Klux Klan violence, and worked to extend civil and political rights to Black Tennesseans, helping secure the right to vote under the 1865 Constitution. Brownlow's methods were controversial, but his impact was undeniable. He reshaped the state's politics and left a legacy that still echoes in East Tennessee. Opposite Brownlow rests John Hervey Crozier, lawyer, congressman, and steadfast Confederate sympathizer. Crozier embodied the old Southern order, calm, measured, and unwavering in his loyalty to his state and its traditions. Their animosity wasn't merely personal, it reflected the very soul of a divided Tennessee. Brownlow's pen clashed with Crozier's reasoned defenses of the Confederacy across newspapers, street corners, and private correspondence. Brownlow's editors skewered Crozier and men like him with relentless favor. Crozier responded with pointed, gentle critiques, never backing down. They sparred over succession, slavery, Reconstruction, and the power of federal government. Both lived to see the war's aftermath, but they never saw reconciliation. Now their family plots lie within a stone's throw of each other, separated only by a narrow roadway. For visitors walking the paths of Old Gray, it's easy to imagine the tension still lingering between these two men, whose words once shaped the destiny of Tennessee. In life, they warred with ink and ideology. In death, they lay as permanent neighbors, their rivalry preserved in stone. But perhaps the most chilling of Old Gray's uneasy pairings belongs to Union Major Eldad Cicero Camp and Confederate Colonel Henry Marshall Ashby, two Civil War veterans whose bitterness survived long past Appomattox. Ashby, a cavalry commander under General Joseph Wheeler, had a reputation for daring raids and fierce loyalty to the Confederate cause. Camp, who served with the Union forces, carried the scars, physical and otherwise, of a war that reshaped his beliefs and the sense of justice. The two men clashed repeatedly after the war. Accusations circulated. Some say Camp had previously arrested Ashby. Others claimed Ashby had threatened him. Whatever the cause, animosity simmered until January 9th, 1868, when fate placed them on the same Knoxville street. What happened next was fast, violent, and witnessed by several bystanders. The men argued, their words turning sharp, old tensions igniting, and suddenly shots were fired. Ashby fell mortally wounded. Camp claimed self defense. A jury agreed with him, but the verdict did little to ease the bitterness his act left behind. And now both lie in the same cemetery, not side by side, but close enough that the weight of their conflict, unfinished, hangs thick in the air. One can almost imagine them frozen in their final confrontation, their argument echoing faintly through the trees. But not all of Old Gray's stories are forged in violence. Some belong to voices that shaped American literature. Cornelius Coffin Williams, father of playwright Tennessee Williams, rests here, his funeral forever captured in the writer's story, The Man in the Overstuffed Chair. Eliza Bon Hodgson, mother of Francis Hodgson Burnham, is also buried in these grounds as well. Her grave one of the few surviving traces of the author's early life in Knoxville, a faint thread connecting the city to the secret garden. Author Peter Taylor drew upon Old Gray's atmosphere too, describing a 1916 funeral in Knoxville Cemetery in the Tennessee country. Many believe he was invoking the grand procession held for his own grandfather, Governor Robert Love Taylor, whose 1912 burial drew tens of thousands. Whether factual or fictionalized, Old Gray's shadows seeped into Taylor's work, just as they have seeped into the city's collective memory. As you move beyond the graves of feuding families, of fiery politicians, and men who met each other in smoke and blood, O'Grady begins to tell a different story, one of ambition, intellect, and quiet influence. The cemetery is not just a resting place for grudges and vengeance, it's also home to men and women who shaped Knoxville and the wider world through diplomacy, education, and civic courage. Just down the hill rests Ebenezer Alexander, ambassador, educator, and early champion of the modern Olympic Games, a man who took lessons from the past and gave them in life to the present. Near the entrance lies Horace Mayard, the loyal Unionist and diplomat who refused to abandon his post when Tennessee succeeded, lending his efforts to history as far afield as the ruins of Troy. And not far from them is Lizzie Crozier French, who transformed personal loss into public activism, raising her child alone while fighting tirelessly for women's rights, living to see every vote she had long demanded become a law. Towering above them all is the obelisk of the Tyson family, commemorating military service, civic duty, and the way that parental grief turned to legacy. General Lawrence Davis Tyson, celebrated for his leadership in World War I, rests here beside his son, Lieutenant McGee Tyson, a young aviator who died in service during this same war. McGee's mother, Betty, completes the family plot, where ambition, sacrifice, and memory rise above the trees, their stone reaching skyward like a silent call to remembrance. The name should sound familiar to many who flown into Knoxville, as the city's airport bears McGee Tyson's name in his honor. Many of Old Gray's monuments stand apart from the typical stones of the 19th century, each carving telling a story that reaches beyond the name and date etched in marble. Even more arresting is the grave of D.H. Holloway, whose death was as sudden as it was dramatic. He perished when a railway bridge collapsed beneath his train, sending the engine and cars plunging into the ravine below. His tombstone immortalizes the disaster in stark relief. The bridge giving way, the locomotive tilting into its fall, a chilling memorial and a permanent witness to a life ending in catastrophe. Just beyond one of Old Gray's winding lanes stands a marble statue of a little girl, delicate and solemn, her gaze cast downward as if lost in thought. Locals call her the Lillian Gaines statue, but her true identity remains shrouded in uncertainty. In the stillness of the cemetery, visitors often lay flowers in her lap, offering comfort to a child who seems eternally waiting. As Jack Neely, co author of The Marble City, once remarked, the Lillian Gaines statue tears me up every time I see it. Whether she was truly named Lillian Gaines, or whether the name rose from a whispered legend, no surviving records confirm who she is. And yet the statue endures, a symbol of innocence, loss, and the unspoken stories Old Gray keeps tucked among its trees and shadows. Not far from Lillian rests the grave of Lazarus C. Shepherd, crowned by a hollow monument that gained a peculiar notoriety during the Prohibition era, repeatedly serving as a discreet drop-off point for bootleg liquor, an echo of defiance carved into stone. The cemetery also holds the grave of Frank S. Meade, the first president of the Ross Republic Marble Company, a reminder of Knoxville's once thriving marble industry. Much of the tombstones and monuments across the city were carved from native Tennessee marble, turning the very landscape into a memorial of craftsmanship and commerce. In the 1890s, H.V. Maxwell wrote in the Chattanooga based Tradesman, describing Knoxville as the marble city of the Union, a city built literally and figuratively from stone, where even the dead rest among monuments to human ambition and artistry. Amid the winding paths and shaded groves of Old Gray Cemetery, once stood a monument of grief and devotion unlike any other, the Albers Fountain, dedicated in 1890 in memory of Ella King Albers. It rose 20 feet in the Knoxville sky, cast in iron and crowned with statues of mourning women, their faces etched with sorrow that never faded. Water once spilled from its basins, murmuring like whispers of prayers among the stones, a lullaby for those who have gone before us. But time and war would not let it stand. During the stark years of World War II, the fountain was dismantled, its iron claim for the machinery of conflict, its voices silenced. For decades, only the empty marble circles remained, a ghostly memory of love and loss, a echo where grief once flowed. In the 21st century, Old Gray's caretakers brought new life into the long lost monument. Using old photographs and the original iron casting that had been preserved, they were able to faithfully rebuild the fountain. Today, with water flowing from its upper basin again, the fountain feels less like a relic and more like a welcome part of the cemetery's landscape. It stands as a reminder of the people who came before, of their grief, their memories, and the hope they had carried. Standing beside it, you can almost imagine the mourning women who once gathered here, and perhaps even feel Ella's presence, quietly watching over a place that had always been part of her story. Olgray is not merely a resting place for the dead. It's a city of shadows, where the living occasionally brush against what lingers beyond the veil. Among its winding paths and shaded groves, the air seems thick with memory, grief, and something else, something unquiet. One of the most enduring figures is the Lady in White. Pale and urethral, she drifts silently among the stones, her gaze cast downward, as if mourning a loss the time is not diminished. Some say she's Mary Crush Woody, widow of the prominent brickmaker Martin Woody. Others whisper her name is Annie Lowe, a woman bound to tragedy and scandal. Witnesses have described seeing her lean against trees or wander the paths at twilight, searching for what never can return. On full moon nights, she's said to appear beyond even the gates, gliding into the surrounding woods like a sigh of the past. Then there is Black Aggie, the shadowy sentinel of Old Gray. Cloaked in darkness, he moves silently among the headstones, his presence heavier than the night itself. Some claim to hear whispers of his name, or feel a chilling touch as they pause among the graves. Photographs taken at dusk reveal his distorted silhouette, an imprint of grief or rage that refuses to fade. Whether he's a man, a spirit, or a fragment of the cemetery itself, Black Aggie has become a living legend, a reminder that some souls linger long after the body rests. The cemetery is no stranger, though, to violent ends. Herb Evers, killed in Knoxville's only recorded duel, is said to haunt the grounds still to this day. His anger, humiliation, and the abruptness of his death cling to the shadows, giving pause to those who wander near his unmarked resting place. And Abner Baker, lynched by Union soldiers, is said to whisper on windswept nights, a restless presence reminding visitors that even some deaths are never at peace. Within Old Gray, the air feels otherworldly, just as the Victorians intended. Its timeless gates, once built to welcome carriages, now open onto a world that seems paused between centuries. There's a subtle sense of being watched, of something lingering just beyond the edges of vision. But the historians of Knoxville are quick to remind visitors that this isn't how they wish the cemetery to be seen. One YouTube clip captures a local historian declaring he refuses to conduct tours in October, when the association with spookiness is strongest. Understandably so. How many would enter the gates of an old cemetery if it were simply old, serene, and solemn? Yet when ghost tales and apparitions circulate, the foot traffic rises, vandalism creeps in, and that quiet and eerie charm risks being lost. Here in the Grim, we revel in a good haunting, but we know that history must always take precedence over the lore. Yet the lore can't be contained. It seeps into the cracks of memory and stone, into whispered conversations, into the restless imagination of the living. Unlike the carefully recorded events of the past, it resists order. It refuses to be cataloged, but it can't be erased. In Old Gray, history and haunting coexist, sometimes clashing in an uneasy tension, sometimes intertwined in perfect harmony. Both are woven into the very fabric of the cemetery, making every path, every monument, every shadow an unforgettable journey into the past and into the unseen. For now, the stories of Old Gray slip back into stone, and the dead return to their uneasy rest. Yet they're never silent for long. Thank you for walking with us through the veil into Old Gray Cemetery, descending once more into the hauntings of history. The gate is sealed, the veil drawn, yet death keeps no calendar, and so we shall return, as we always do, on the Grim.